Good morning, good evening, and welcome to episode one of If Data Could Talk. My name is Andy Cotgreave. I'm technical evangelist at Tableau and co-author of the Big Book of Dashboards. And I'm going to be joined in this series by Amanda Makulec. Amanda, say hi and introduce yourself.
Hi, Andy. I'm Amanda Makulec. I am the Senior Data Visualization Lead at Excella, a consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. I also am the Operations Director for the Data Viz Society and have a master's degree in public health. So very excited to talk about these different charts and graphs around COVID-19 today.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you with us. So, Amanda and I, along with occasional guests, are going to dig into the ways in which data is being used throughout the COVID-19 crisis. We're going to look at visualizations, storytellings, and also at storytelling, and also at some of the deeper ways data is being used in the political, social, or cultural landscape of this crisis. Each episode, we're going to share 3 or 4 things that you can read, watch, or listen to, each one of which has something special about the whole theme of data literacy. We have 2 goals. First of all, we want to inspire a conversation. We want to know what your responses to these things we're sharing is, so join the conversation. Also, let us know interesting things you find. But the bigger goal is that when we get out of the other side of this crisis, we want people to have higher levels of data literacy and be able to lead a more data-informed life. So I hope you enjoyed the series, and with that, we're ready to go. Are you ready, Amanda?
I'm ready, Andy.
All right, here we go. Ahead, I shall share my screen first, and we're going to do the first. I'm going to do the first 2 charts. First of all, we've all been learning the complexities of understanding log scales and exponential growth, complex concepts that even people like me struggle to understand, let alone lay people. And yet, to get your head around a pandemic, you've got to learn how these work. So what we're looking at on screen here is from ABC News in Australia. It's the best explainer of this complex statistical concept that I've seen. They've used scrollytelling, a great technique that works, on any medium. But also they've recognized that to explain a really complex concept, such as exponential growth and log scales, the trick is to introduce it piece by piece. Axis, what is a mark? What does one line look like? What does another line look like? And so on, until you end up with a very complicated chart. What ABC News did is recognize that they could show any complex data visualization as long as they bring people along with them. Imagine if they just published this piece with a complicated chart and no background, then only the experts would have been able to see this, see the story. So I encourage you to go and read this so you can see it move at your own speed and understand how complex data concepts can be conveyed piece by piece. And also, this is, generally one of these positive outcomes of this crisis. Millions and millions of people are already becoming more data literate by understanding and seeing these charts. So go check that one out. Let us know what you think. Secondly, I want to highlight a fairly specific but powerful data visualization technique if you want to create a really visceral response to exceptional numbers. As we all know, last week, mind-boggling numbers of new unemployed people across the US. This chart from The Guardian shows those numbers. It's an incredible data point. Well, what I wanted to show was how a couple of papers and some of the press showed this on their front pages. This is the Wall Street Journal, and what's amazing is how they use the annotation layer, the text around the chart, to emphasize this incredible growth and create an emotional, visceral response to the number. We're accustomed to charts staying in their boundary, and yet this, easy data visualization technique conveys the sense that the numbers are so exceptional, they've actually broken through the borders into the rest of the page. If you go and check out some of the stories on Twitter around this, you can see that it actually isn't a new technique. Ben Jones, who runs dataliteracy.com, shared the old chart there from 1919, where the number went right down, broke the grid lines at the border. And Alex Selby-Boothroyd from the Economist team shared one showing exponential inflation growth in Zimbabwe. So high, it went out of the chart. So this is just a really good technique if you want to create that visceral emotional response to exceptional numbers. So that's it. There's just 2 quick things to go and check out. Nice techniques to read. That's what I've got for you this week. Amanda, any thoughts, and I'll hand it over to you now.
I think it's notable that it's not just the Wall Street Journal that used that similar technique, but we saw that also on the New York Times that had that one last bar spanning the entire height of the page, which I think is just remarkable to see in terms of how people are using that space on the front page of their newspaper. All right, let me go ahead and pivot over and show a couple other examples, and then we can dig into these as well. I've wanted to focus a bit more on some of the kind of novel visualizations that we've seen this week. I think we've been watching a lot of the different ways that we've seen lines and bars plotted about cases and deaths, but developer Romain Voimont, I apologize, Romain, if I'm butchering your name, he developed this interesting chart type that people have been calling a sawtooth chart that tried to make sense of how quickly some countries had repeating patterns of 500 deaths. So each of these individual triangles represents the point at which, in a number of days, the country hit another 500 deaths. And what's interesting about this chart, I think, is both its novelty, but also the kind of visceral response you start to get when you see this accordion effect, this kind of sawtooth effect across these different countries. And I really appreciated that he iterated on this concept over the course of a couple of days. And you can see how he started to simplify some of the ways the information was presented. A question that I asked was, how are you defining what the starting point for each of these triangles is? And so he added some nice annotations to try to make more sense of kind of where people were starting in terms of when each of these little sawtooth lines starts. So this is the last iteration that he had, focusing on the first death being the point of alignment for each of these different countries, and then showing these different triangles that unfold, with the last update being the 28th of March. And for me, looking at this and talking with some of my data viz colleagues, it just evokes such a visceral response in you when you see this repeating pattern and the density of those little spikes and points that happen as you get to that 10,000th death in Italy, and how just compressed that period looks. And he did iterate a bit on looking at whether we should look at this on a calendar view or an indexed view. And that's been another conversation we've had about COVID data, is how do you make sense of and compare countries when countries have had their own epidemic trajectories starting at very different points in time. And so this gives an interesting comparison of one view that has it on a calendar, so we can see that the deaths in China started much earlier than in any of these other countries. But also looking at an indexed view that lets us better have an aligned scale of sorts around starting at the point of the first death and really having the scale on the x-axis be the number of days. So I think that there's so much value in looking at some of these novel charts that help us think about data differently and help us really kind of feel the data in a different way. You can almost see how this chart could be sonified, adding some additional sound layers. The last one I want to talk about is this example of how a small company called Tectonics showcased how they could track where people were moving based on cell phone GPS pings. So zooming in right here, you'll see zooming in on a location in Fort Lauderdale on a beach around spring break. And you can see that they're identifying all those individual little dots that represent different cell phones. And so as we watch this pattern unfold, what we see as it kind of unfolds over time is the movement of those dots, and that movement that happens across different parts of the US with people flying back to their different locations where they're coming from. And it's just amazing to me to think about how quickly this kind of exposure can spread just based on a couple people's decisions or a group of people's decisions to not heed some of the social distancing guidelines. And just watching this kind of pattern unfold and seeing how far that this small group of dots, relatively small to the US population, can spread and interact with people in other locations is just remarkable. And so as we think about the challenges we'll face from an epidemiological perspective around contact tracing, just think about the challenge of tracing down all of the different people who say were on this beach and all of the contacts who they interacted with. So Andy, any thoughts from you about some of these examples and what we're seeing happen in terms of the more novel visualizations?
Yeah, so I think you're right. The emotional aspect of the sawtooth is incredible. When you talk about sonification, I think that's fascinating. I thought that too. But the tectonics example just it opens a rabbit hole of thoughts. Each one of those is a cell phone, and then you can track where those cell phones go. And every time I've seen those talked about on Twitter, almost the first reply is always, "Wait, people have this data? Well, how come they have this data?" And it's like, oh, wake up, everybody. You've been giving away that data for free to Google and just about every location-enabled app you have already ticked, allowed to share your location. It should not be a secret that that data is being shared and used, for good or monetization purposes. And it also highlights just the cultural differences. In China, they are monitored. In Singapore, slightly more free society, there's much more eager or permission to allow that data to be used for epidemiological purposes. Whereas in the Western societies, we're all like, hang on, we have a really interesting question. Should we let this data save lives at the expense of personal liberties or not? And I think we're waking up to that. In preparing for this, I just went down a rabbit hole and read. There's a huge amount of commentary about people waking up to this. Are you seeing that too?
I am, and I've seen it a lot in conversations with a lot of my colleagues who work in international development and humanitarian relief, because that's been a question that people have grappled with in a number of other disaster settings, right? Or in other outbreaks. So looking at the ways in which cell phone data was or was not used in Ebola in West Africa 5+ years ago. And so I think looking to people who have grappled with these ethical questions before and what kind of guidelines that they're sharing is a really good space to start. The same way we look to epidemiologists to help us understand the case data, I'm really looking to people who are experts in privacy and understanding kind of what those ethical constraints are and where we balance out that question of how do we look at the greater good and the benefit to the greater good that can come from having this kind of granular location data for an outbreak that really has a lot of very relevant need for analyzing location-based data. We're not mapping things for the sake of mapping them. It's important to know where these cases are. I think it's important to look for people who can help advise us and help us think through some of these tricky questions.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I was reading a piece from The Economist, which led me to a lawyer in the digital governance space called Sean McDonald. And, he's been talking a lot in the last couple of weeks about the temptation to use this technology and look for the really shiny potential applications that we could do. And it's kind of like the Silicon Valley temptation. Whereas, we could be using all that technological know-how just to increase supply lines for PPE equipment, right? It's really attractive to look at some of the bigger options, but yeah, fascinating stuff. Go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say, and just thinking about kind of who owns that data, right? That's the big question too here, is who owns that data. And it's tough when those Silicon Valley firms are the ones who we've already checked I agree to this terms and conditions document and said yes to. So I think figuring out how we use that data for good, but also being thoughtful about how it can be misused is a really important thing that we all should be thinking about right now.
Yeah, marvelous. Great. Well, you know what? We're going to keep these short and sweet, so we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much for watching. Do leave comments. Get in touch with us. Let us know what you thought. Do you disagree with our opinions or agree? And have you found other interesting ways that data is being used in this modern COVID-19 lockdown situation? All right, Amanda, thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy.
And we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.